In May 2026, an explicit pornographic video appeared on Brian Houston's X account. The founder of Hillsong Church, the man who built a global Christian empire reaching 30 countries, who launched careers, who baptized celebrities, who stood at the center of one of the most influential evangelical movements of the past 3 decades, had pornography posted on his verified social media account. His response: he doesn't watch pornography. Someone with access to one of his devices had compromised the account. Whether you believe that explanation or not, the image of it, Brian Houston's name, Brian Houston's account, explicit content, landing in the feeds of his remaining followers in May 2026, is, in a single image, everything the Hillsong story has become. Not a church navigating a difficult season, not a ministry working through a moment of challenge, a global institution in a state of accelerating, documented, multi-year collapse, and a founder whose name continues to generate headlines for all the wrong reasons, years after his resignation. This is the full story, from the beginning. Every scandal, every departure, every cover-up, and the question that the current moment forces into the open: is there anything left to save? What Hillsong built, the scale of it. To understand the magnitude of what has happened, you first need to understand what Hillsong was at its height. Founded in 1983 by Brian and Bobby Houston in Sydney, Australia, Hillsong Church grew from a small suburban congregation into one of the most globally influential Christian movements of the modern era. At its peak, it claimed presence in 30 countries, 16 churches in the United States alone, a college, a television network, and a worship music operation, Hillsong United and Hillsong Worship, whose songs became the soundtrack of evangelical Christianity worldwide. The church's aesthetic was deliberately contemporary. Pastors wore shredded jeans and leather jackets. Services were held in venues that resembled concerts. The music sounded less like traditional hymns and more like arena rock. And it worked, drawing young people who had never engaged with church before, making Christianity feel culturally accessible in a way that traditional denominations had never managed. Celebrities attended. Justin Bieber called Carl Lentz, the charismatic lead pastor of Hillsong NYC, his spiritual mentor. The church appeared in Vogue. It generated Grammy Awards. It became, in a very real sense, the most culturally connected Christian institution in the world. Then, beginning in 2020, it started falling apart. Carl Lentz, the fall that started everything. The first and most public crack appeared in November 2020. Carl Lentz, the face of Hillsong NYC, the pastor who had been at the center of the church's celebrity culture, the man who had baptized Justin Bieber in an NBA player's bathtub, was fired. Brian Houston announced the termination, citing moral issues. Within days, Lentz confirmed on Instagram that he had been unfaithful to his wife Laura. What followed over the next several years was considerably more complicated than a simple adultery admission. Multiple former staff members came forward with accounts of bullying, abuse of power, and a culture of fear inside Hillsong NYC. A former staff member alleged that Lentz had subjected her to a pattern of behavior she described as psychologically abusive. An investigation by an independent law firm into Hillsong NYC's culture was conducted, and its results were subsequently leaked. Lentz later said he had been browbeaten into signing a non-disclosure agreement to receive severance from Hillsong. He described his firing as a betrayal. He admitted to a sex and prescription drug addiction. He landed at Transformation Church in Tulsa, and was later removed from that role as well. By 2024, Lentz announced he was no longer in ministry. He has since announced a podcast. The Carl Lentz chapter did not end Hillsong. It began a sequence that would. Brian Houston, the founder's own reckoning. If the Lentz scandal was the crack, Brian Houston's own downfall was the collapse of the foundation. In early 2022, an internal investigation at Hillsong found that Houston had acted inappropriately toward 2 women in 2019. He resigned as global senior pastor in March 2022, calling the investigation's findings wrong and hurtful. That same year, Houston faced criminal charges in Australia, accused of concealing his late father Frank Houston's history of child sexual abuse. Frank Houston, also a pastor, had abused a young boy over a period of years. Brian Houston had known about this for years and had not reported it to police. The trial concluded in October 2023, with Houston found not guilty. The court determined that he had not concealed the abuse in a legally culpable way. in part because of the mental health challenges he was experiencing at the time. Houston described the verdict as vindication. His critics pointed out that not guilty and did not know are different findings, and that the documented timeline of events raises questions that a criminal acquittal does not resolve. Meanwhile, in a separate matter, Houston had been charged with driving under the influence of alcohol in February 2022. He subsequently pleaded guilty. An Australian Member of Parliament launched an investigation into the church's spending. The Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission investigated Hillsong College and found it had failed to meet several compliance standards, though the commission was subsequently criticized as a toothless tiger for accepting a remedial plan rather than imposing meaningful consequences. Natalie Moses, a former fundraising and governance coordinator for Hillsong Church, filed a lawsuit alleging that the church had misled donors, misappropriated funds, and evaded taxes. That lawsuit added documented legal specificity to what had previously been whistleblower accounts. The Hillsong Dallas campus was shut down entirely after reports emerged that its pastors had been using donations to fund lavish personal lifestyles. Across multiple campuses, multiple countries, and multiple years, the pattern was consistent. An institution that had raised enormous sums of money from devoted followers, with accountability structures that proved inadequate to prevent abuse of those funds. Hillsong San Francisco announced its separation in February 2025, with lead pastor Brendan Brown describing a sense of being called to fresh vision, a framing that the Roy's report and others noted was notably careful about not directly citing the scandals. Then, in January 2026, Hillsong lost an entire country. The Hillsong Moscow campus, which had operated under the Hillsong brand since 2007, officially renamed itself Legacy Church in November 2025. The stated reason involved Russian legislation around English-language business names. But the founding pastors who had originally planted the Moscow church offered a different framing: a changed culture. Truth, accountability, and restored relationships is what actually heals a church, they told the Roy's report. A renamed church, a founding couple citing accountability failures. The pattern of careful language describing departures that everyone understands are about something more than logistics. The May 2026 incident, and what it says about where Houston is now, and into that context, in May 2026, comes an explicit video on his social media account. The question is not whether the account was hacked. The question is what it says about the ecosystem this man continues to inhabit, and what it says about how far the institution he built has fallen from the global evangelical powerhouse it once was. The NDA settlements and the voices still waiting. One of the most consistent patterns across the Hillsong accountability story is the use of non-disclosure agreements to manage the aftermath of harm. Carl Lentz alleged he was pressured into signing an NDA to receive severance. Anna Crenshaw, a former Hillsong College student who alleged she was indecently assaulted by a married Hillsong administrator, refused to sign a settlement offer from the church because it included what she described as a requirement to lie. She eventually reached an undisclosed settlement after years of publicly documented struggle. The Hillsong pattern of managing harm through legal instruments, rather than genuine accountability, is documented across multiple cases and multiple countries. The NDA becomes the mechanism by which the institution protects itself, while the people harmed by it are asked to trade their silence for settlement. This is not unique to Hillsong. It is not unique to Christian organizations. But in an institution that built its entire public identity around authenticity, community, and the transforming power of grace, the deployment of legal silencing mechanisms against its own victims is a specific and documented betrayal of everything it claimed to represent. What remains and what does not. As of mid-2026, Hillsong Church continues to operate 5 U.S. campuses, a global network reduced from 30 countries to a smaller footprint. A worship music operation whose songs are still sung in churches whose congregations may not be fully aware of the institution that created them. Phil Dooley, who took over as global senior pastor after Houston's resignation, has apologized publicly and announced independent reviews. Whether those reviews have produced meaningful structural change is a question that the people who have left, the 11 U.S. campuses, the Russian church, the departed staff, the plaintiffs in ongoing lawsuits, appear to have already answered with their feet. What Hillsong was at its height is not what it is today. The cultural moment that made it possible, the convergence of celebrity Christianity, contemporary worship aesthetics, and a generation of young people looking for something that felt real, has passed. And what replaced it is a documented record of leadership failures, financial mismanagement, sexual misconduct, NDAs, and a founder whose name continues to generate headlines in 2026 that nobody associated with a healthy institution should be generating. The songs remain. Hillsong United's music is still played in churches around the world every Sunday. That is the particular tragedy of this story. The genuine good that was embedded in the institution's best work, existing alongside, and now inseparable from the documented record of what happened in its leadership. That is the complete documented picture. From Brian Houston, founding a suburban church in 1983, to an explicit video on his social media account in May 2026. Here is what I want to know from you. When you hear a Hillsong song in church now, knowing what the documented record shows about the institution that created it, what goes through your mind? And what does that tell us about how we should think about separating art from the institutions that produce it? That is a genuinely difficult question. Drop your honest answer in the comments. This community handles these conversations better than most. Subscribe if you are not already. Turn on notifications. The Hillsong story is not finished, and when the next development arrives, you will want the sourced account. Thank you for watching. Stay discerning.